Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everybody to our second session with the Book of Illuminations. Last week was amazing, and so I'm so excited to have another session tonight. I just wanted to start by, as usual, highlighting the amazing khutbah from yesterday. It's called Weaponizing the Language of Human Rights, the Secular Religion of Our Age. These last khutbahs have been really powerful for me personally as highlighting what we as Muslims really need to focus on to get ourselves, in a place where we matter and where we're relevant and where the things that we weigh in on make a difference in the world. Yesterday, the khutbah was really hard to hear in the beginning because, there are some news items that came across that I'm not sure how many people are aware of, but for example, 200,000 Palestinian families are about to lose their UN food aid. There are food vouchers that these families rely on. And, it's life obviously in Palestine is just unspeakable. It's impossible to get a job. It's impossible to have anything of normalcy. You're living in an open air prison. For what people do there in terms of representing the Muslims around the world in protecting Al-Aqsa Mosque and, representing for all of us in this very sacred space, you cannot help but wonder, when you put together all of the things that the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians, whether it's, destroying their homes, now, preventing them from getting jobs, ending support. I mean, around the world, there was so much to be said. Obviously, the UN needs $51 million in order to continue this food voucher program. That is money that is a drop of a hat for, so-called Muslim-led governments who spend way more than that on soccer players and yachts and homes. It's unspeakable. But it's something that obviously, it's so painful to watch. It's hard to listen to a khutbah like that, and then from there hear about, for example, now the what's happening to Hui Muslims in China. Clearly, the Chinese feel that they are within their right to, do whatever they're doing. They've put Uyghurs in concentration camps, and now they're destroying mosques around China and focusing on Hui Muslims, what's happening with the Hindutva, the impending genocide in India, and just how many stories around the world, right? It's hard, as usual, to listen to the khutbahs and get the roundup of what's happening in the world. But what's important, I think, yesterday's khutbah was really powerful for me because understanding the language of human rights, Sheikh explains how this is really the secular religion of our age, and how people are so strategic in using human rights language to gain advantage and put Muslims down. So, for example, if we, identify what's happening to Uyghur Muslims as a genocide, a very different set of laws and rules kick into effect than if we maintain referring to that as, human rights abuses. These are things that are really important strategically for us as, citizens of this world, Muslims, to really understand and get to the forefront of, because as things stand, we really don't matter in any of in human rights discourses, in so many discourses around the world. We know that Biden is just now passing some regulations around, the terminology of anti-Semitism. I mean, we already have so many examples of how people conflate, anti-Israel criticism with anti-Semitism. Again, this is a very skilled, very strategic use of the language. And as Sheikh warned us yesterday, we can probably anticipate that the, Hindutva will learn a lot from the Israeli playbook on what they've done with Palestinians to adopt their attitude towards Kashmir. So it could become that if you start criticizing the Hindutva, the Hindu nationalists, for their treatment of Muslims in India, that now you could become accused of being anti-Hindu. So, these are things that, human beings decide upon. They're things that, we as human beings weigh in on and can influence. These are the things that are, existentially problematic for us as Muslims as we, represent the vast majority of refugees, the vast majority of orphans, the vast majority of people living in war-torn areas, in genocides, in horrific situations around the world. And yet we find ourselves as Muslims in the community being very occupied with other things that are not at the same level of existential crisis. Even if we talk about something like, there's an article that just came out about artificial intelligence, and how the godfathers of artificial intelligence have now released a statement. It's a one-liner that says, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. So do we as Muslims weigh in on issues of AI when we know AI is fundamentally Islamophobic? This is something that will, it affects all of us. And so, this is in a reference to a lot of, I guess, communications and questions that I've received about, whether or not we are going to, or Sheikh is going to weigh in on the latest obsession of Muslims, which is the navigating differences, clarifying sexual and gender ethics in Islam. I don't want to talk about that. This is a complicated issue. It's something that requires a lot of nuance and sensitivity. It requires people who are directly affected by these issues to weigh in, and it's not something that can be so easily waved away or dealt with in one statement signed by people who are not qualified in Islamic law to weigh in on whether Sharia says one thing or another with absolute clarity. We've gone through now the tafsir. We've talked about a lot of these issues that would be important for these types of proclamations about the position of Islam on LGBTQ and whatever. There's a lot of stuff out there. I want to remind people that Sheikh has weighed in on these issues. For example, there is a wonderful conversation he had with Mamadou Tall. You can find it on the homepage where he talks about these issues. There's a lot that we, Usuli, have put out that address the things that would need to be addressed when dealing with such a sensitive topic. But just to remind people, we live in an age where there are priorities. There are so many issues that concern, the existence, the survival of Muslims. I would love to see all of these people come together on a statement about Al-Aqsa, about Jerusalem, about orphans, about refugees, about racism, about all of the things that affect us at a much higher level of priority and existential crisis. So that's my own personal comment on that. I don't believe that, at this time it's worth saying much more than that. We've put a lot out there, so I leave it to other people. But I really, it pains me when so many things directly impact the health of Muslims, and Muslims are just completely out of the conversation. I would love to see us come together and make an impactful statement about things that really make a difference, that matter, that are, not to say that those things don't matter, but to say that we have to have a sense of priorities, and we have to weigh in where it's an issue that, as a Muslim, honestly, I want to be proud that we are weighing in at the front lines of things that matter for the world. And I want to be able to point to things that Muslims talk about and be proud of them. And I feel like we get distracted. We get pulled into things that take us away from something as simple as, okay, what are we doing about the 200,000 families in Palestine that will have no food as of next month? What are we doing about that? What are we saying about that? And who's going to protect Al-Aqsa when Palestinians there are decimated? There's just so many other things we need to be talking about. But anyway, so please, I encourage you to watch the khutbah from yesterday and also the last three. I know someone responded or has contacted me about how do we watch a khutbah like yesterday's and not get, really depressed and overwhelmed. And I think again, to focus on this message of individual excellence that Sheikh has been developing in the last several khutbahs as a response, because if we as Muslims can really get to the forefront of every field and then start weighing in on things that matter, we can start turning the tide. So I'm so grateful for another session tonight with the Book of Illuminations, and so thank you so much for joining us, and thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب العالمين. Okay, so inshallah we'll continue our journey with Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya. I'm not quite sure how far we'll get today, but we'll see. I'm not. There's no point to summarizing what the introduction that I gave last halaqah, but it is really critical because this material all builds upon each other. It is a cumulative material where you can't omit any part of this discourse and somehow emerge enlightened by it in any sense. It's all cumulative. And so the introduction that we covered last halaqah is essential to anchor us as to what these principles of illumination are intended to achieve. And then the very first principle that Ibn Ata introduces, which, if properly internalized, if one works to internalize, it shifts the nature of one's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there, and something that we'll explore more today, or we'll add to more today, that the deeds are critical to, even if you love the Maker, you love what the Maker loves. And as we said last time, that the nature of the Maker is a nature of ihsan. And ihsan is a constant state of giving, and constant state of contributing, and constant state of enriching. And so to attain a relationship with the Maker through any pathway other than the pathway of ihsan is by definition implausible. That it is committing to a philosophy of deeds that fully embraces the and remanifests, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. The internalizes the sifat al-ilahiyya, internalizes the attributes of the divine, and remanifests these attributes is critical for the relationship. Yet, knowing fully well that ultimately nearness to the divine and illumination and sort of achieving a state where you lift the veil between, or the veil between you and the divine is lifted. It is not a matter of who has the more deeds or who has the lesser deeds. Because relying on one's deeds as a measure of one's goodness itself is a state of arrogance, as we talked about. And that ultimately, when you approach what is beyond your comprehension and what is far greater than the self, and what you present, and none of your deeds ultimately are, none of your deeds, when all said and done, of course, I mean, you present them as proof of love, but the deeds themselves are not love. And the state of nearness, and this that special maqam that brings you truly to a closer intimacy with your maker, is entirely dependent on the purification of your intentions and the set of internalized ethical qualities that are the deeds themselves are not the purification of your ethical qualities, but what purifies the hearts, because the deeds ultimately, and as we'll talk about, the worst illness that defeats the purposes of deeds, the illness that often arises from deeds of doing good is what is known as riyah. Basically, a form of hypocrisy, where the deeds become themselves the source of your egoism. And you ultimately, it is as if you shrink the majesty of the divine into the miserly and petty functions of your deeds. So it is as if God is no greater than the practical deeds presented. And what you could end up with is that effectively what started out as a path to the divine became, when all said and done, you circled back to a path to the ego. And you ultimately, your deeds became a form of aggrandizing and inflating and worshiping your own ego. And as Ibn Atta starts out with his first principle, he says, that the evidence of this is that do do you understand that your deeds are not your end all and not the ultimate purpose, but in fact, that your deeds are part of a dynamic of cleansing and purifying your intentions. And we will see the trajectory of principles, all focusing on this issue of intentionality as we go on. Okay, so let's take the second principle. It's very subtle, but okay. إرادة التجريد مع إقامة الله إياك في الأسباب من الشهوة الخفية، وإرادتك الأسباب مع إقامة الله إياك في التجريد انحطاط عن الهمة العالية. Let's see how this guy translates it first. So this translation in this book says, you're aspiring for isolation when Allah puts you among the causes of everyday living is a covert ambition. And you're aspiring for the causes of everyday life when Allah prefers isolation for you is a collapse from exalted steadfastness. Another translation in this book, your desire for isolation, even though God has put you in the world to gain a living, is a hidden passion, and your desire to gain a living in the world, even though God has put you in isolation, is a come down from supreme aspiration. Okay, so what is this all about? Well, the tricky thing here is the word isolation, because as I mentioned in the last halaqah, Tajreed in the Sufi tradition is a term of art. And for the world of asbab is the world of causality and causation. The world of asbab is being fully engaged with the struggles of life. Now, you are fully engaged in whatever other people are engaged in order to make a living, in order to provide for others, in sort of the mundane causality of life itself. Tajreed is not necessarily just isolation. In the Sufi tradition, they talk about, first, tajreed means to remove something. So if you say jarrattu jild, means that I've removed the hair on my skin. Or if you say jarrattu thawb, it means I've taken off my clothes. Thawb means garment. Jarrat is to remove something. So tajreed in the Sufi tradition, they speak about 3 levels of tajreed. There is tajreed al-zahir, there is tajreed al-batin, and there is tajreed al-zahir wal-batin. So there is tajreed, let's use the word for now, purification, or abstinence. The abstinence or the withdrawal of al-zahir, of the external. So what does that mean? Well, ultimately, you abstain from engaging the world of causality because you are engaged in the world of abstinence. So in the realm of the zahir, in that level of tajreed al-zahir, you refrain from providing for others, you refrain from providing for yourself, you refrain from doing anything that involves you in the practicalities of life. Tajreed al-batin is where you could be very well engaged in the practicalities of life, but inwardly, whether these practicalities work for you or do not work for you is all the same. In other words, your body is engaged, your intellect is engaged, but your heart is completely disengaged. So you do what you do for whatever demands or duties or requirements that you have to meet, but your heart, your spirit is completely elsewhere. And usually what you read in this context is that if you achieve abstention externally, so externally, in outward appearance, you seem to be an ascetic, a person who is not engaged with the affairs of this world. But if you are internally, while you appear to be disengaged, but you are internally, in fact, engaged, that makes you a hypocrite. And that's the worst state you can possibly be in. So that you are, when it comes to your external affairs, you pretend to be someone who is not interested in the world of causation. But in fact, if your heart is very much engaged, then that is the ailment of ailments. That is where and it is the most dangerous, and it is also the most common disease, because all types of people claim to be in a state of tajreed. All types of people claim to be in a state of isolation and abstinence. But in fact, what is in their heart is quite different. If your tajreed is internal but not external, so you are externally engaged but internally disengaged. That is a very high maqam, that's a very high station, but it is very hard to achieve. And it is very hard to achieve because the psychological makeup of human beings is that whatever their body is submerged into, or whatever it overwhelms the affairs of the body, has a direct impact on the psychology of your soul or your spirit. So it is extremely hard for instance, the example that they always give in the if you can imagine a someone of a very high maqam, you can put them in prison, and that prison could be a piece of hell. They could be living what is physically a miserable life, but if they're truly in a state of tajdeed and they're internally have achieved this state of abstinence and isolation, their external world has little impact or no impact upon their internal world. And you can imagine how difficult that is. So, for instance, the famous story about Hallaj is that as he was being tortured before his death, and he would yell out at his torturers because they were extremely frustrated that doesn't scream from pain, and that he continued to seem to be unaffected by what they were doing to his body. And then Hallaj would keep yelling at them, "Ziduni, ziduni," give me more, torture me more. His internal was entirely unaffected by whatever was happening to his external body. But that's a rare state and a very difficult state to achieve. Now, the third is where you are able to be in a state of abstinence and isolation, externally and internally. Now, for every Sufi, the dream, if you will, is to get beyond the world of causality and to engage reality and to understand reality, to see reality, to experience reality beyond the world of causality. For the dream of every traveler on this path is to reach a state in which they get beyond the comforts of life, get beyond the demands of life, get beyond the physical and material limitations of their life. The problem, though, is that yes, this is what you crave, but the state of tajreed itself, that state of abstinence and isolation, is a dangerous one because it can very easily become a form of escapism, can very quickly translate into a form of irresponsibility towards others and the self, can very quickly translate into a form of cowardliness, that in fact what you are doing is not you are abstaining because you have achieved a deeper understanding and a deeper relationship to reality, but in fact you are using the mystical journey as an excuse to escape the rigors and the demands of life. And they even, in this context, they always warn you of, and this is one of the things that you learn early on, that there are so many people who start on this path and they hear or they perhaps meet people that are truly remarkable examples of this this condition of tajreed. I mean, for one, you could find, you meet people that can survive on very little sustenance, or who, despite the very little that they consume, seem to be in amazing health, who, despite having very little material, seem to shine with light and happiness, and people gravitate to them, despite the fact that they seek isolation from people and do not want recognition. They are, you meet them and you're struck by the extent to which they are a source of blessing, and just it's, even if finding the words to describe it is hard. It's often, people are just describe them as, it's as if they emit a perfume by the very nature of their being. And there are so many on this path that start out saying, this is what I want to achieve. This is how I would like to see myself. I would love to I would love to love God and know of the secrets of divinity, what they call kushufat, or the unveilings. That I would love to see reality through the eyes of these great masters and have the types of experiences that these great masters have. Because in many ways, you are transcending the limitations of your physicality with, the oppression of your nervous system. You are beyond your nervous system. Things don't impact your nervous system the way that it impacts the vast majority of human beings. But because you force the state of isolation and abstinence, when in fact you are not ready for a state of isolation and abstinence, what quite often happens is that you stay in the state of isolation and abstinence, but you grow tired of it very quickly. So you do the long hours of zikr, you do you put on the to the best of your ability the pretense of benevolence towards all, love towards all, forgiveness towards all. But as life gets harder, because a state of tajreed is also a state of very severe tests, where you experience material deprivation to very extreme extents. And I've actually know a lot of people like this. It's not just that I've been told about these stories, but I've actually know a lot of people who've gone through this, where you go back to the world of asbab, to the world of causation, and you become convinced that because your experience in a state of abstinence led to literally nothing, and you didn't want to live a life of hypocrisy, so you abandon the state of abstinence or the state of tajreed. And what you conclude from this is, I tried the path of abstinence, and it leads to nothing. And in fact, you sort of, your entire, the way you judge, the way you understand what human potential and human possibilities, and the way you understand the whole world of the spiritual is colored by how poor your experience was with the state of tajreed. And so the most common scenario that you'll have someone on this path and they'll go to their master, if they're doing it, they're pursuing the tariqah with a Sufi master, and they'll tell their sheikh, my dream is to quit my job, my dream is to quit my school or whatever, and to just do nothing but follow you and live basically in service of the tariqah. And that's why this is the second principle in Ibn Ata''s, why he places it as the second principle immediately. Because there are numerous shuyukh who are that become, their ego becomes tied to the tariqah itself. And as a result, they will give permissions, or they will allow students to withdraw from society and to dedicate themselves to the path of the tariqah, when in fact these students are not at all ready for a state of tajreed. And the result becomes the type of tariqahs that you hear turned into some cultish situation of some. This is precisely how that happens. Now, so at the Sufi level, you do not seek after a state of tajreed. It comes to you if Allah wants it for you. I mean, I'll give you a practical example just to bring for many years, my dream has been that I quit my job and dedicate myself full-time to Islamic work. And for as long as this dream has existed, Allah has never given permission. How do I know Allah has never given permission? Is that Allah has never facilitated it. And what this principle is saying is embrace what Allah put you in, whether it is a state in which you are in the world of causation, and don't become restless by saying, well, I see myself, I'm getting, I've been working very hard for 30 years, for 40 years. When am I going to be allowed to be in a state of tajreed? It is simply not your right to ask that question, or you can't, when you are ready, if you truly have a relationship with Allah, when you are ready, Allah will facilitate it. But it is also a warning to teachers. Do not use your tariqah to facilitate states of tajreed when people are not ready for states of tajreed. Now, we don't belong to a tariqah, so I'm going to just, I mean, because we can say so much about tajreed and asbab in Sufi pursuits. But how does this affect people who are not in that path, which, I've talked about last halaqah? It is part of, if you develop a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you enter each stage of life, Allah will facilitate for you the stage that you should enter next. Embrace the stage you're in. You can explore, you can try to open venues for the next stage, but if they do not open, understand that this is an indication to embrace the stage you're in and to be at peace with it. The role of human restlessness in the ego always coming and saying, okay, been there, done that, what's next? Is quite often a hidden demon. And embracing fully the stage you're in with gratitude and seeing it in the best possible light is part and parcel of wisdom. That is why often you go to a teacher and you say, I want to do this and I want to do this, and the teacher will say something like, Inshallah, it will slow you down, because the human restlessness to constantly push the boundaries onto the next, is often the source of a great deal of upheaval and anxiety. Now, before we move on, in the state of tajreed, is often people think that it is just an abstinence and isolation. But it is really, tajreed is not just a state of abstinence and isolation, it is a state of moral qualities. So, often there are the adab, or there's discussions about the nature of the ethics that are required of a person in a state of tajreed. And often, whether you have these ethics are an indication whether, in fact, your abstinence or your so-called isolation is genuine or another form of egoism, and ultimately a form of hypocrisy. So, in a state of tajreed, there are four there are four qualities and four qualities. They say sometimes they're described as external qualities and internal qualities, but English doesn't translate here well, but I'll tell you the four. One is al-hurma ma al-akabir. So in a state of tajreed, you are always irreverent and respectful towards those who are older and those who are more knowledgeable. وَالرَّحْمَةَ مَعَ الْأَصَاغِرِ, and anyone who is younger or less knowledgeable or of a less status, you are always merciful. وَالْإِنصَافُ مَعَ النَّفْسِ, but insaf ma'a nafs here means not, it means fairness with the self. But here, al-insaf ma'a nafs is not, it is an understanding of the self that is consistently critical and not prone to being impressed by the self, but exposing the self to the self with rigorous honesty. And an indication of al-insaf ma'a nafs, and proof of that, is that they say al-insaf ma'a nafs is often equated to adam al-intisar laha, that you do not bother in a state of tajreed to defend the self or to try to aggrandize or to put the self in a better light in front of others. So you are reverent, you are merciful, and you are rigorously self-critical, and you are never defensive. So as evidence of a state, as part of the practice of state of tajreed, is that you simply are not interested in defending yourself against misunderstandings or accusations. These are often described as the internal, and as you can see, they're not quite internal, but English, as I said, is the reason I said there are four is that they all say al-insaf ma'a nafs wa adam al-intisar as 3 and 4. That you are rigorous with the self and that you don't defend yourself as the fourth. And the other four that are often described as external are muwalat al-abrar, that you are in a state of tajreed, you are always in the company of those who are people of the highest morality. In a state of tajreed, it is particularly critical that you are, the quality, the company you keep is of critical importance. Muwalat al-abrar, this is one. Mujanabat al-fujjar, this is two, that you stay away from people of immorality and unethical people. Wa iqa' as-salah fi al-jama'ah, the third is that you worship regularly in jama'ah. So, because often people think that in a state of tajreed, you do all your prayers in isolation, and that's not true. In a state of tajreed, in fact, you do the 5 prayers in jama'ah, and then the additional prayers is what you do in isolation. And the fourth is muwasat al-fuqara, that you are constantly engaged. And there's tons of material written about this, like in a text, Masqut al-Qulub, is that in a state of tajreed, you are affirmatively called upon to keep the company of those who are destitute and powerless and poor, and that you become a source of mercy to them. Because so many in modern forms of Sufism, and there's a story behind this, but we don't need to get into it, is the completely odd. I mean, because it's odd, it's actually quite a modern thing. That tajreed is that you go into a room and you lock yourself, and that you. This is often how people who develop a relationship with jinn and they go down the path to evil. That's how they do it. They go into a room and then they isolate themselves in a dark room, and they do all types of rituals that last nights and days, and then at the end of these rituals, they actually do develop a relationship with jinn that manifests to them, and it's a very different path. The state of tajreed in the Sufi tradition is the purification of your internal self and forcing the external self into a set of exercises that bolster humility within the internal self. And that is why, for instance, it's not just that you stay away from material comforts, but you actually keep the active company of people who are destitute. And your social level becomes their level. One could talk about this much more, but I think the other thing is, I've got to, because I've encountered this among so many hip Sufism. I mean, especially in the West, hip Sufism has become. I mean, when I compare Sufism in countries with long traditions of Sufis and the type of people who immigrate to the West and set themselves up as Sufi masters and sort of create Sufism for white people. A state of tajreed, the teacher is not supposed to give permission for a state of tajreed to a student who is eager to engage in a state of tajreed. So what you often find in the Western world, where someone will come to the teacher, and say, I want to quit life and follow you, and then the teacher will say, okay, yeah, go. We're going to immigrate to Jordan or immigrate to, I don't know, Mauritania or immigrate whatever, and there you will live and just follow me. Actually, an affirmative ethic of tajreed is that tajreed would be something that will be difficult for you, because I'll say it that it is not خفيف على النفس, because ما خف على النفس فلا خير فيه. Let me try to translate this. That whatever comes to you because you covet it, and whatever comes to you because you crave it, in a state of spiritual elevation, is actually not what you're supposed to do. In spiritual elevation comes from friction and struggle. So if what your soul desires is to quit making a living and to isolate yourself from social affairs because this is where your happiness is, then I am, as a teacher, not supposed to give you permission to do it. Because if this is what, in fact, what will make you happy, there's no growth in that. It is when you, in fact, find your happiness in making a living, in engaging in the world of causation, and by taking you out of that and putting you in the world of tajreed, world of isolation and abstinence, that in fact you will miss the material things you give up. You will miss the job that you give up. You will miss the education that you gave up. That's the type of student that I'm supposed to put in a state of tajreed. Because it is the sacrifice that will enrich your spirit. Whatever comes to you easily that's an indication that that's not what you're supposed to be engaged in. Very, very different than my experiences with hip Sufism in the West. And generally speaking, it's because a lot of the folks that come to the West and they set up shop as Sufi masters, I mean, they're, as often happens with immigrants, they're not exactly the most pristine and the best type. Okay. Okay. Let's go to number 3. So, part of this is now in one a big issue in Islamic theology is the whole notion of predestination, qadar, and so on. And we don't need to get into all the debates about qadar, but there is often especially in the modern age, a tendency among so many Sufis, and I think this is more in the later parts of the Islamic era, and especially in the post-colonial era, where so much of the theology of predestination returns to the Islamic world, partly as a justification for the failures before colonialism. It's sort of, well, it was all decreed by Allah, so whatever happened could have not been avoided, and it's a form of apologetics. There are, what part or how much of life is in fact destined at the moment of creation, although there are a lot of ahadith, many of them problematic, about what is and what isn't. But let's put it this way. There's no question that there are things that are a part of your destiny the moment you come to this life. But in my belief and in my theology, or the theology that I follow, other things become a part of your destiny or not a part of your destiny, depending on the decisions you make in your life. That there is a great realm of issues that are yet to be determined when you are created. And depending on what choices you make, it affects your destiny all the time. It is, these modern video games where, I don't know what you call them because I don't play them, but, these games where if you make certain choices, there are certain endings. If you make other choices, there are other endings. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, like role playing games.
Like role playing, yeah. I mean, it is, I mean, being silly, but it's sort of something like that. It is where your choices is constantly affecting your destiny and the destiny of others. Now, when you have a relationship, an intimate relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are making your best efforts in order to fulfill what Allah expects from you. But beyond that, you trust and you accept what Allah determines for you. So, having done your best to effect things in a way that is consistent with God's normative expectations, you are in ultimately always in a state of surrender and peace with what Allah determines for you. So in fact, your decision making, the closer you have a relationship with your Maker, the more the project of your life feels like a collaborative effort. The more you are constantly, you feel that you ask Allah for guidance on what choices to make, and having made these choices, you feel that Allah's determination of your destiny is in fact done in collaboration with your dua. There is a famous hadith that there are folks لو أقسموا على الله لأبرهم. There are folks that are so close to Allah that if they would أقسموا على الله, how do you translate this? Like if they would make a special appeal to Allah for something to happen or not to happen, Allah would feel duty bound to answer their appeal. And I believe that the basis of this belief is a long story, but I believe that a part of the blessings of an ummah is the extent to which an ummah has these types of people in its communities. Put differently, I believe that the more an ummah has these individuals that are truly whose prayers reach the open doors of the heaven, this ummah will be in a more blessed and safer state. And again, this is all, I understand this is all very controversial, but part of what troubles me about the deterioration of the Muslim Ummah, especially in the centuries that the century right before colonialism and after colonialism, is that these blessed human beings became more and more and more a rarity. And in fact, that, this idea that Muslims entered into modernity, and I know that, I might be talking about things that are not familiar to the majority, but that there used to be all over the Muslim world a practice of something called the zawaya. And the zawaya were they were literally like sanctuaries for spiritual people who abstained from the affairs of life, but who would become mythical in their closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that communities before colonialism used to have a very strong ethic of celebrating these sanctuaries and supporting these sanctuaries. So a community would, in fact, go out of its place to create spaces for these sanctuaries and to feed the holy people, unquote, that populated these sanctuaries. Now, all of these zawaya, all over the Muslim world, after colonialism, disappeared because they used to be supported by a community that did not look at these people as unemployed and useless, and that sought the dua of the... So why am I mentioning this? I think among the huge spiritual losses for our ummah and the huge cultural losses for the ummah is the destruction of these zawaya. And I grew up being taught that the people in these zawaya are useless bums and that no one should ever, it's a good thing that these zawaya were closed down in all over the Muslim world. But the more I researched the history of the zawaya and who actually came out of these zawaya, including people like Ibn Ata al-Sakandari himself, eventually, and what type of cultural and spiritual transformations took place in the Muslim world as these zawaya were being shut down. Like, for instance, when Ataturk came to power, one of the first things he did is he banned all the zawaya in Turkey. And it became illegal to even donate money to a zawiya. The zawiyas don't exist anymore in the Muslim world. But when you internalize the understanding that there are folks that if they would ask Allah for something, Allah would be duty bound to answer their call. And you understand the role of these folks, for instance, as Muslim armies would go to battle, that these folks would be called to duty, to be in constant state of dua. From the time that these armies would go to battle to the time that they would return to battle, all of this stuff has been eradicated from Muslim culture. I mean, instead of the shuyukh of the Zawiya, and now you have some useless sheikh who has the education of, a high school graduate and the intelligence of a peanut that is attached to the military, that, leads army officers and prayers, and that kisses up to the government of the government, whatever the government wants, never stands, unlike a lot of the shuyukhs of Zawaya, never stands up against injustice, etc., etc. in Muslim culture, Muslim spiritual culture, throughout the Muslim world, has been, including in countries like Iran, and especially in countries like Iran and Saudi, have been thoroughly erased. If you compare what existed before colonialism to what exists now, you discover that we are living in a completely different epistemological reality. Okay, so I apologize for the tangent, but how often does one get a chance to? Okay, so Ibn Atta wants to anchor another principle in telling you, as Ibn Atta tells you, embrace the moment. Worry about your relationship with Allah. And your relationship with Allah will tell you whether it is time for a change. But embrace the moment you're in. Do not be restless with the moment you're in. Understand what Allah wills for you as, because it's a blessing, because it's Allah's will. And if you work on the quality of your dua, the nearness of your dua to Allah's ear, then you know that Allah is hearing you. So then what principle needs to be immediately raised here is to tell you, remember that صوابق الهمم لا تخرق أسوار الأقدار or أسوار القدر. That, and actually it is al-aqdar in the plural, and I'll tell you why in a second. But let's see. Yeah, very simple. سوابق الهمم, antecedent intentions cannot pierce the walls of predestined decrees. That سوابق, the language here is actually really سوابق الهمم. That, remember that al-himma is your extra effort, your extra exertion. Why is it sawabiq? Why is it antecedent intentions or antecedent exertions? Because you've exerted, or speaking to his students, is saying you exert much reflection and much construct careful intentionality and articulate determinations to achieve, and these are good-willed determinations because the determinations on the path to Allah. And you logically say, well, if I want to serve Allah, why isn't the fact that I put so much effort and so much planning in something that is ultimately good? And Ibn Atta is simply providing the reminder that, remember that your intentionality, and this is why the plural of al-aqdar is important, that your intentionality and your carefully planned intentionality is always interacting with your destinies, with the plurality of destiny. And however, a part of your journey along this path is to ultimately, after doing your best in antecedent exertions, in other words, your full preparatory work, doing your homework, in our modern language, ultimately accepting, as long as your relationship with Allah is where it should be, accepting that whatever Allah presented for you is good because it is from Allah. And it is the first rule of bad qillat al-adab, first rule of bad manners or misconduct with Allah, to tell Allah why. Why yes or why not? You may take yourself to task because you didn't put the antecedent effort, and you take yourself to task. But with Allah, you must accept what Allah presents to you. Ultimately, because Allah knows your effort, and as long as you've done your homework, then you accept what Allah presents you with full satisfaction, because having, even if you don't articulate it, but if your attitude is basically one of why God, that's qillat adab, that's bad manners with Allah. If you truly trust the divine, there is no why God. Questioning a decision, the ultimate form of questioning a decision is why not, right? And think of a professor who gives you a grade and a student comes and say, why? It's a sign of disrespect to the professor, because it is either telling the professor you erred or you're unfair. The higher your superior, now we do this with God, but we do it, some people actually will articulate it, but we do it with God often through our attitude. And Ibn Atta, because this is among the first things you work on, because if you cannot control the attitude, they always say that is the portal to the demonic in your psychology. If ultimately your ego sees itself as entitled or equipped or qualified or authorized to retort back to God and say, I'm unhappy with your decision, I don't see myself at fault because I didn't do my homework or I didn't do what I was supposed to do. I see the problem with your decision. There is no path forward in terms of growth. The whole thing, you will remain static. You will go in a constant circular motion of your relationship improves with Allah and then crumbles. You will constantly be locked in this cycle. You feel a bit better, things are, sometimes it's just the chemistry of your brain, or things go your way a little bit. You get in a better mood. You perhaps concentrate a little better in prayer. You perhaps, you're not asking irreverent questions of God for a while. But as sure as the good times will be, you will go back to the bad times. It has been since the beginning of history and has been for centuries with the billions of people that inhabited this planet. It always is. You're a little bit better, and then you go back. The minute something has that ruins your mood, your attitude with God goes back to the same irreverence of, really? What is this whole relationship about? Even if you have some adab that you don't articulate it, but that will be your attitude. And you find yourself, you can't focus on prayer, you're not that excited about doing this or doing that, and you keep locked in the cycle. And then the true disaster, now this is the real disaster, is when someone actually imagines themselves on the path to spiritual elevation, and then their teacher has given them permission to tajreed, meaning, quit your life and follow me, because I see this all the time. And they have not even mastered this. All these stories, for instance, that come where you hear about some student of a Sufi thing and they commit sexual abuse. This is at the heart of it. It's not that these people were evil from the day one. It is that these people had good days, had good times where they thought they're happy with their qismah, they're happy with what God has given them. But then their mood shifted, and they started looking at all the things that they're going to miss out on life. Oh, the woman I married is not as pretty. I'm going to miss out on this or miss out on that. And you're human. You can do a little bit of that. You can, indulge in a little bit of whatever, and they slip. And that is why if you have a responsible teacher, and if you have a genuinely qualified teacher, each stage must be taken slowly and seriously, because the price of falling is disastrous, and the damage that's caused by falling is disastrous upon the faith of people who are, can you imagine every time on this tariqah someone falls, can you imagine how it affects the faith of so many others? What time is it?
8:48.
Okay, we can. Okay, I should speak less, but there is the same hadith. I should have remembered that earlier, but there's the other hadith, for instance, that is that's mutawatir, and that, I don't know anyone that actually disputes the authenticity. The famous that where it's a hadith Qudsi, where Allah reportedly says, إذا أحببت العبد كنت له سمعا وبصرا ويدا ومؤيدا, and so on and so forth. That Allah says that as a person gets closer to me, they reach the point where I become this person's eyesight and hearing and hands and ally. And to reach that state where truly Allah is your perpetual companion, There is in the Sufi tradition they talk about الفناء في الصفات والفناء في الذات. It's very difficult to translate that, where where you maybe I should have brought it up. It's too complicated. What is? How do you translate fana?
And not like to immolation or like to
Yeah, to emulation, to
like kind of like to fall apart in or to come apart.
to dissolve oneself in. I mean, but that's a bad dissolve. What do you say?
Emulsify almost. Is
Emulsify. Yeah. In God's characteristics as opposed to God's essence, and there are like these long discussions about in this in order to become, for the divine to become your eyes, your ears, to so that you see with the farasat al-mu'min, that you see with the internal insight. I mean, these are not. These are stages of intense sacrifice. I mean, no growth is achieved without sacrifice and pain. And but anyway, okay. Let's go on to the next principle. Okay, now we are at number 4. أرح نفسك من التدبير فما قام به غيرك عنك لا تقم به لنفسك. Translation: rest yourself from self-direction for what someone else has carried out on your behalf. Do not you yourself undertake to do. Let's see how the other book translates it. This book translates it: don't bother to think about your worldly fortunes. Why do you undertake to do what someone else has already done on your behalf? I agree less with this translation than the other translation, because this translation clearly subscribes to the theological belief that your worldly fortunes are predetermined from the get-go. And if that means that they're predetermined regardless of what effort or lack of effort you put into it, then I completely disagree. And Ibn Ata''s language doesn't require us to, but Ibn Ata''s language is actually quite more discerning than that. So, if something else has been planned for you, if there's already something that is decided, then it is irrational to waste time planning, or irrational to waste time worrying, because it's already decided. Now, so the instruction here is that if something has been resolved or decided, do not exert effort in trying to duplicate the effort or trying to plan. the, and I know that this is not what you normally encounter, but as we said, that the reason that what makes this worse, the commentary, as opposed to just reading whatever text, is that this is my take on Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya and my understanding of Ibn Ata al-Secondary's theology as well, is that it is only your intimate relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that will give you a grounding in what truly is part of Allah's qadr, and therefore and what can be relegated to Allah's qadr, and therefore you should not exert any effort in planning, and what it is incumbent upon you to plan for. There are affairs in life that what you can do is not planning, is not tadbir, but is dua. But once you do the dua, there is arrogant dua and there is humble dua. Arrogant dua is that you are calling upon God for results, and you are going to be upset if Allah doesn't deliver the results. That type of dua, as a matter of adab, it is better to refrain from that dua than make it, because it is sin greater than the dua. Yes, dua is closeness to Allah, but if your attitude towards Allah is either you give me this or I'm going to be upset, ultimately the act of dua is not going to draw you closer to Allah, but will actually draw you further from Allah. Even if Allah answers the dua, that type of dua, once Allah gives you what you want, you will very quickly forget gratitude. And your even if you're thankful shortly after you get it, your sense of thankfulness will last only as long as your happiness with what you've just received, which, believe me, doesn't last very long. So that path of dua, Allah, I want, but if you know within yourself that if Allah doesn't give, you are going to be upset, astaghfirullah, angry with God, my advice to you, refrain from doing the dua. It is better to not engage in the dua at all, because ultimately that dua is a dynamic that will push you away from God, not bring you closer to God. If your dua, however, is dua that Allah, I am asking you, but Allah, ultimately, as I'm asking you, I'm surrendering the matter to you, then there is no point in tadbir, there is no point in planning or worrying, because you've surrendered the matter to Allah. And whatever Allah gives you, you will accept from Allah. Now, I understand that we're human beings, and sometimes, people intend not to be disappointed, but then they become disappointed. But as long as you're conscious of the problem and you don't surrender to that dynamic of letdown, which is not appropriate adab with God, then I wouldn't worry about you as much, because you have a conscience that is resisting that dynamic. But your relationship, and that is so, it is your relationship with Allah that will tell you, I've done everything I can do on my part to discharge my obligations, and now the rest is up to God, and I completely accept that. And this is where Ibn Ata''s advice comes in. It is not, as you see among some misguided people, who basically say, and there is who turn this into some form of tawakkul. Tawakkul is where you basically say, oh, just leave everything up to God and refrain from doing dua, which is it's completely against the sunnah of the Prophet. Because if our Prophet ﷺ was, as we'll talk about inshallah in the seerah, was his entire life was dua. So for someone to come now and tell you, oh, just refrain from dua, that's just insane. The other part, and it is not a form of, all form of engaging the material world and causation in a dynamic of planning. Remember, tajreed is a rarity, and it is a state only if you're truly ready for. But even tajreed, as we saw, is based on ethical principles and it is a means to a state. But the rest of us, all of us, live in the world of causality. And you must discharge your normative obligations. And it is only upon reaching that point of, well, I've done my part, then you can be at peace with the fact that you are not to blame, or you did not need to do more, and you leave the rest to Allah and be completely at peace with that. As some would put it, لا تختار لأمرك شيئا ولكن اختار الله لأمرك. So don't choose a thing, but choose Allah for your. Don't choose a path, but choose Allah for your path. So it is my first choice, or my primary choice is Allah. And once I've chosen Allah, Allah becomes my choice is Allah. I do what I have to do as a matter of obligation and duty, but I leave the rest with you. There's another thing that this is actually comes from Ibn Ata himself, who says that tadbir, because he was asked, well, you say in your principle that some students understood it as a condemnation of tadbir, as a condemnation of making plans or planning things. And Ibn Ata said, what I intended is a tadbir al-mazmum, is the form of tadbir that is reprehensible. And what is he wrote this in his Tanweer, in a book called the Tanweer. What is the tadbir? What are the planning that is reprehensible? He said that the type of planning ما شغلك عن الله وعطلك عن القيام بخدمة الله وصدك عن معاملة الله، والتدبير المحمود هو الذي يؤديك إلى القرب من الله ويوصلك إلى مرضاة الله. So, and he has a whole passage in Kitab al-Tanwir, but what he's saying is that there is a reprehensible form of tadbir planning that I'm talking about. And the reprehensible form is any form of planning that, just taking from his text, any form of planning that makes you put yourself ahead of Allah. That in fact, instead of being an engagement in which you are surrendering to Allah, it is an engagement in which you expect Allah to support whatever you want. While the good form of tadbir, al-mahmud, moral tadbir or ethically correct tadbir, is the type of planning that brings you closer to Allah and ultimately is a form of mardatillah, is a form of pleasing God. Well, what type of planning is pleasing to God? Is that you do your due diligence, that you do your homework. What type of planning is pleasing to God? Is whatever planning that is in partnership with Allah and ultimately tells Allah, my planning is an exercise ultimately in affirming trust in you, not trust in myself, but trust in you, and trust in the direction that you will lead me. What time is it?
9:07.
We covered how many principles now?
We did 3 today. That was the 4th one.
Fourth? Let's do the fifth because I think we can cover it in hopefully in 10 minutes or less. Okay. So the fifth, I don't know if it's just my impression, but I feel like today has been dense, and I'm feeling like I shouldn't overdo it. Is that true, or is it just my impression? No? Has it been dense? No? Oh, okay, so I'm just paranoid as usual. Okay, it's number 5. اجتهادك فيما ضمن لك وتقصيرك فيما طلب منك دليل على انطماس البصيرة منك. You're striving for what has already been guaranteed to you, and your remissness in what is demanded of you are signs of blaring your basira. It's not your intellect. Here it says blaring your intellect. Basira, your perception. Okay, this book says this book didn't number the Hikam, so it's sort of 4. You're striving for what has already been offered to you, and your negligence in what is demanded of you show the deterioration of your insight. Yeah, basira is closer to insight than intellect. Okay. The thing to say here is that notice that normally, I mean, a lot of Sufi texts take this as saying, this among the things that have been guaranteed is your rizq, your wealth. And the thing I mean, how many people do you know that in fact have a level of wealth or any level of risk without juhd, without exertion? So to take what Ibn Ata says here about risk is unfair because it bolsters this image of the Sufi as a lazy bum, someone who just doesn't want to work and wants to sit around and expects people to, and the real path is far from that. You have to do your duty, and best think of your risk is part of the, instead of your personal risk, think of the risk of your family. If someone sits around and refuses to exert any juhd, any effort, and as a result, their children are starving, and you come to them and say, well, it's because I understand my risk as guaranteed by Allah. And so we would all agree that that's reprehensible conduct. And we intuitively would recognize that as reprehensible conduct. And in fact, in the Islamic tradition, there's a very strong ethic. My brother told me of a story that reminded me of how strong that ethic is in native Islamic culture. And the idea that any money that you make without juhd, any money that you make without effort is haram. And the story that my brother told me recently is of a very old and poor woman in Egypt. This was apparently on TV. There's a program that goes around and finds poor people and then asks them, goes to people who look like they're who are needy, and asks them a couple of very easy questions like, I don't know, what's the name of the president of Egypt or something like that. And then if they answer the question, they give them thousands of Egyptian pounds, which, of course, today's currency is not worth much. But anyway, so this program found this very old, poor woman, and the guy asks her a couple of questions and then says, okay, you've won 10,000 pounds. And she absolutely refused to take the money. And the guy kept begging her to take the money, and she kept saying it's haram. Why is haram? Because I didn't work for this money. And if I didn't work for this money, and what I mean, this tells you the extent to which we've become alienated from is that she reminded me of a very old principle that you used to hear from our grandparents all the time, that in any money that you earn without juhd, without working for it, is haram. And they would tell you when you were a child that that's the reason that riba is haram, is because it's money that you're making without work. And so that ethic in Islam, that your risk, in fact, is something that you have to work for, is very deeply anchored. And it sits in stark contradiction with the pop theology that you hear from Muslims nowadays and modern Muslims, that tell you, and something that Muslims say but don't believe and don't practice. Oh, your risk is decided from the minute you're born. Well, if that's the case, then why do you study and become a doctor? Or why do you study and become an engineer? And why do you immigrate to the United States? And, if that's really what you believe, why is it that we, harass our children and tell them that you've got to become a doctor, you have to become an engineer, because we want to make sure that you're making, because although this pop theology is something that we repeat all the time, but innately we don't believe and we don't accept. And indeed, as you discover when you go beyond pop theology, that your risk, like a lot of other things, it is determined by Allah in relation to your choices and your effort. So this is your destiny if you do X, Y, and Z. The alternative is your destiny if you don't do X, Y, and Z. But here, what Ibn Atta is saying and alerting us to is something beyond that. And he's telling you there are things where your exertion, like your planning, but your ijtihadak fil amr, your hard work, doesn't make a difference. And there are things where, in fact, you are expected to exert yourself, تقصيرك فيما طلب منك, that and failure to do what you need to do is malfeasance. It's dereliction of duty. And notice here it says, what is required to differentiate between the two? It's basira, it's insight. Now, it is very interesting because Ibn Atta, which of course lived centuries ago, as we said, 13 centuries, in his Tanweer, again, the one of his texts, the example he gives, because again, there are students who asked about this, and he says something that I wish modern Muslims would reflect upon. It says that it is the failure to understand this that has led so many to support muwalat al-zalama, to support the unjust, and to support the unjust because in truth they covet prestige and covet the safety allowed by the unjust, but they use this principle as an excuse in mawalat al-zalama, in supporting the unjust. Well, how did they use this as an excuse in supporting the unjust? In that they said, well, we can't, since the unjust ruler is part of Allah's will, then this is an example of a field where our juhd would be entirely useless. That the unjust ruler is Allah's will, and so if you have insight you would do absolutely nothing to change that reality. And I think it is rather very significant that if you look at a lot of the Sufi commentaries in the 13th century and at the beginning of colonialism, at the beginning stages where most of the people who resisted colonialism were in fact Sufi orders, because and that's why colonial powers put in an enormous amount of effort and money into corrupting Sufi tariqas, whether in Algeria or in Morocco or in Libya or in Egypt, because they discovered, and what strikes you is, in fact, that was constantly one of the examples given as to how lack of proper insight, proper basira, confuses those who have weak nufus, weak selves, into surrendering to injustice and saying, well, while this is an example where our juhd is better off not expended. And so, knowing what in fact is, as in the theological language, what in fact is a punishment from Allah because of the failure to exert your juhd. You've done bad, and as a result of your misconduct, by failing to do what you needed to do, God allowed a fate to befall you that is horrible, like unjust ruling over you. As opposed to things that in your one of the very interesting things that I wish modern thinkers would rediscover is that would tell you the issues that you surrender to destiny in are personal affairs. Social affairs, it is presumptuous to say that it is a matter of destiny. That's completely different than the way we think today. Growing up where I grew up, we flip the whole thing on its head. Often, we will treat our personal affairs like this is where we can change fate, and then when it comes to social affairs, we all pretend like it's as if this comes from the Holy Writ. It's completely upside down, flipped on its head. That it is the reason is that your personal relationship with Allah will teach you to accept someone's impending death. Okay, it's gonna, that's Allah's will. It is your personal relationship with Allah that will teach you to accept a child who is born with certain medical conditions that perhaps are incurable, despite everything that you wish or you try. It is your personal relationship with Allah that will teach you, and remember, one of the amazing examples I've read, that Allah, of course, told us that among Allah's signs is what? The differences in your alsina, in your tongues, and the differences in your color. And so it blew me away when I find that one of the examples they give is that you would accept the gender of your child and you accept the color of your child. So here is where you must, your relationship with Allah is that, okay, that's Allah's will. I have a girl, I have someone who's short, I have someone who is whatever color, darker skin, bright, whatever. But when it comes to the affairs of society, here the obligation is al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. And the question is discharging your taklif in enjoining what is good and resisting what is evil. Not an ittikar, not surrender. So, and that is what the whole notion of telling you that it is your basira, because basira plays a role, especially in basira is focused on your personal relationship with Allah, but basira may not be used to justify the robbing of people of their rights. One final point, and this is a sort of a subtle point that, again, pop theology often gets wrong. Often when you encounter modern day people who call themselves Sufis, I mean, for better or for worse, they confuse between two very different things. And often you encounter an attitude that equates Sufism with surrendering to the evils of life without judgment as to the evils of life. So, an example, when Trump passed the Muslim ban, it blew my mind that I met some people who see themselves as Sufis, who actually had the gall to say it is part of, Muslim ban is part of Allah's will, and being angry at the Muslim ban is being angry at Allah's will. So part of supposedly your Sufi theology, or theology of surrender, is not just accepting Trump as Allah's will without looking as to the way that we are to blame for this Islamophobe, but putting the blame at Allah's doorstep and saying this is what Allah wants and you have to accept this, and sort of celebrate Trump and his Islamophobia as Allah's will. But all evils, including racism, Allah's will, and you can't be angry about it. Including police brutality as Allah's will, and you can't be angry about it. Including the Muslim ban as Allah's will, and you can't be angry about it. And actually, one such guy told me, well, in the same way that there is a Muslim ban, all evils will end, and when Allah wills, it will come to an end. As if you can just sit on your butt, do nothing, and Allah brings it in, Allah takes it away, it's all the same. This is precisely the way shaitan comes in and corrupts the whole theology of tawakkul and ittikal, of reliance on Allah. And this is where, and we will see another example, inshallah, next halaqah of this, because Ibn Ata explores this in several principles at much greater length. But what is never forgivable whether you are able to change something or unable to change something, someone who journeys on the path is always called upon to recognize evil for what it is and condemn evil if, as a last resort, in themselves. So it is never the case that accepting Allah's destiny, it is one thing that you accept Allah's destiny personally for you. The Muslim ban affected me and I was not able to study in the United States. I'm not going to blame, so I have to be at peace with what has befallen me. I can be angry at those responsible, human beings who are responsible for this injustice, but I am at peace with what Allah willed for me. But personally, but when it comes to recognizing evil in society, al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, I am under a constant obligation to diagnose evil, to recognize evil, and to condemn and fight evil in every way I can. So there's a world of difference between saying, for whatever reason, I can't fight the Muslim ban because the government has my children and has a gun and told me if I demonstrate against a Muslim ban, they will execute my children. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I'm just giving an example. There's a difference between that and saying, well, we just have to accept the Muslim ban as Allah's will. You can never accept the suffering of others and the injustice that befalls others, even if you forgive it, because as the way it befalls you, even if you forgive it at the personal level, but you do not have the right to forgive it as the way it befalls others. So all those who think that Sufism, because this is the modern post-colonial Sufism, because, this is another story to be told at another time, what colonial powers have done to corrupt Sufism in Algeria, in Libya, in Mauritania, because all the fights colonialism had when they colonized the Muslim world were Sufi orders. Remember, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was a Sufi. Omar Mukhtar was a Sufi. Al-Mahdi in Sudan was a Sufi. All the people in Muslims in Kenya in the massacre of Kubkub, where all the French massacred 1,000 Muslim shuyukh in this town of Kubkub. They were all Sufis. And what you encounter today we have to accept the unjust ruler, and we have to accept injustice, and we have to accept the corrupt and celebrate them because they're God's will. That's neither Sufism nor Islam. That's neither Sufism nor Islam. It was never Islam. And at a minimum is to recognize what is wrong and to condemn what is wrong. If you can't do anything else at just the personal level. So when you find someone that pretends to be a Sufi by giving you a clownish smile, and you tell them about what's happening in Palestine and say, I've never said anything for or against because I'm a Sufi. I don't express opinions about Palestine. You tell them you're neither a Sufi nor a Muslim. You're neither a Sufi nor a Muslim. You're simply an immoral human being who uses Islam to justify your immorality. This is critical because the number of times I've run into this blows your mind and gets to and to the point that you say, where's our religion? Where can you find our religion anymore? Okay, so this is now 5. Okay, so let's stop here for tonight, and inshallah, we'll start with 6 next halaqah.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As always, thank you so much for an incredible session. I think what is so empowering and so consistent, when we learn from you and hear you really break down so many misconceptions, it's liberating and empowering to hear you address a lot of this pop theology that you refer to, and address like a lot of, I think, behavior or things that we see that don't really comport with beautiful, social justice-oriented, action-oriented Islam. And it's so beautiful to see, like, again, this is a continuation of all of the ethics and morality that we learned going through the tafsir. But, when you can really give us these examples of things that we've seen and say this is really wrong, because how many people have said now, you can't stand up, this is Allah's will, this injustice or whatever. And, we know in our hearts that that's just simply not true. And all of those kinds of dispelling myths like you're building, the foundation for us and adding more and more empowerment with every single myth that you break down, or every single, pop theological statement that is put out there. And it's so beautiful to reconnect us with, our tradition. I know I've heard you in the past say, 90% of all Muslims were Sufi not that long ago, which is something that a lot of times people, don't know. Even telling us about the Zanaya, right? These Zawaya, the people that would pray. I can understand, after everything that we've learned through the tafsir and through this, I can understand what an amazing idea, what an amazing institution where you have these incredibly pious people praying for all kinds of things, and of course the immense blessing that is removed when that doesn't exist anymore. And just re-emphasizing this message that you've taught through your approach and, your methodology, that Islam has to be reasonable, has to be beautiful, that, it requires sacrifice to grow. And even just like looking at my other notes, the distinction of destiny when it refers to your personal situation as opposed to societal. And that all of it really depends, again, on our individual choices and our relationship with Allah, which is just, the constant theme. It's so beautiful. So, I think that just the consistency itself is extremely powerful. And with every bit of knowledge that you present to us here, I think it just gives each of us that much more empowerment and confidence in our faith. And that is such a gift. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And look forward to the next session, inshallah, next week, where hopefully we can get a few more wisdoms. Have a great week. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.